All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let's begin. So we left off, today's daf is Nun Dalid. We left off on Nun Dalid. So we left off V'ilu Gabi Negia. So let's remember again, this whole thing got started because we had a statement of Ula. We had a statement, of Reish Lakish. So remember again, Reish Lakish wanted to suggest that Lamaisa, again, a limb that has a kizai, a limb, even if it doesn't have a kizai's basar, and even if it doesn't have etzem kisaura, could go ahead and convey tuma b'mago ubemasa. And what he wanted to suggest is that comes from the ribui in the pasuk. And again, the Gemara started dashing this pasuk yesterday. We ended off with the interesting discussion regarding tuma ola ubokaas, and how tuma extends upwards is fundamentally dependent on whether or not there's a tafach of space in between the corpse and we'll call the lid of the casket. So we went through that yesterday. But yet when it comes to touching, I will say, now remember, in this context, what he means over here is, remember different forms of tumas. So we were speaking a lot about tumas ohel, but tumas negia is the simplest form of tuma, where again a person touches a davar hatame and ultimately contracts tuma that way. So v'ilu gabi tuma, v'ilu gabi negia, Amar Rav Yehuda, Tanya, b'chala nogea be'etzem o b'chala. So remember, the pasuk says that whoever goes there and touches an etzem, a bone, o chalal. We'll say chalal ultimately means a dead body. So the Gemara says be'etzem. Now the Gemara is going to dash in each of these ideas. What does it mean be'etzem? Ze etzem kisa'ora. This refers ultimately to what? To a bone the size of a barley kernel. That if you touch a bone, that's, as remember, we'll say we've already seen, etzem kisa'ora will convey tuma only through maga and masa, but not ultimately through ohel. So here the Gemara is learning it out. How do we know that etzem kisa'ora ultimately is metame? So he says, again, because the pasuk says etzem. Etzem teaches me that even if the bone fragment is only the size of a barley kernel, it conveys tuma. So o bechalal, what does it mean, or a dead body? What does that refer to? Ze'ever hanechla minachai, ve'im ba lahalos aruka. This refers ultimately again to a limb that comes from a living person, but does not have enough flesh on it to go ahead and regenerate. I mean, had the limb been attached, it would not have had enough flesh to be able to regenerate. So, what the Gemara is saying like this is that Lamaisa, again, in that case, it wouldn't convey Tumas Ohel, but it would convey what? It would convey Tumas Maga. O b'meis, what does it mean again? Or with a dead person. Ze'ev hanechla min hameis. This refers also to a limb that does not have a limb that comes from a dead person, that again does not have enough flesh to be able to regenerate. Obekever, that again, I will say, the Gemara is teaching me, the drush is teaching me, that these types of items will still be metame betumas maga, through touching. Obekever, what does obekever teach us? Or in the grave, Amar Reish Lakish, this is actually very interesting. Ze kever shelifnei hadibor. This refers to a grave before Matan Torah. I will say, now what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. This is amazing. Obekever, Amr Reish Lakish, Ze kever shelifnei hadibor, kilomar, sha'ovdei kochavim metamin b'maga, af api metamin ba'ohel. So it's an interesting halacha. That in general there's a fundamental machlokes as to whether or not a Gentile corpse conveys tuma or not. So the Gemara says over here, the Gemara is going with the opinion that says that the body of an Ovid Kochav, the body of a Gentile, conveys tuma with maga, but not with ohel. He says, Kivisanya, Kivre Ovdei Kochavim in metamin ba'ohel, ella benegia. Okay, rather only through direct touch. So the Rush goes into the limud for this, which we don't have to go into now. Ella svechol shahaya kodem adibor. Listen to this. Kodem matan Torah. Bein shel ovdei kochavim bein shel Yisrael. Kari le kever ben Noach. Vekever ha'ovdei kochavim la'achar adibor. Kekodem adibor she'in metamin ba'ol. Lefish lo nitna lehem torim. Shumachi kari le kever shel Yisrael. Listen to this. We'll say. This is interesting. When did we become Klal Yisrael? Meaning, when was the Jewish nation born? Jewish nation was born ultimately again at Har Sinai. This is why when people say that Avraham Avinu was the first Jew, it's not really a correct statement. Avraham Avinu was not the first Jew. Avraham Avinu was the first popular monotheist. He wasn't even the first monotheist. He was the first popular monotheist. The Jewish people, Am Yisrael, does not really begin until Matan Torah. That's a function. Am Yisrael is a function of Torah. So here's what's amazing. So the halacha was, this is what the Gemara is saying, and this is a wild idea, that before Matan Torah, when it came to Hilchos Tumah, there was no difference between, we'll call it the offspring of Yaakov Avinu, and the Gentile nations. Meaning that no one conveyed Tumas Ohel only tumas maga. See, interestingly enough, if you were to go ahead and visit the grave, if you were to find the grave of a Jew who died, or I should say, right? Yeah, we'll call it a Jew. A Jew who died before Matan Torah, so his remains, his grave would not be matami tumas ohel, only tumas maga, just like in Oved Kochavim. I'm sorry. Yes. So the answer to that is we don't hold like this, right? Right. That's the simple answer to all of this. Truth is, Marasa Machpelah is actually a different issue, because there's a whole discussion Kohanim and Marasa Machpelah. So remember, there's a whole shita that says that tzaddikim eina metamin afilu b'misasan, or nimeisan afilu b'misasan. So that's why many Kohanim go to Marasa Machpelah. That's okay. But we actually this shita is not accepted lahalacha. In any event, the Gemara says Zeh kever shlefnei adibor. So kever refers to this specific case. Ultimately, again, we'll call him a Jew who died before Matan Torah, whose remains ultimately only convey tuma out tumas maga, but not tumas ohel. So the Gemara says, "Hi, Evrim mace hechidami." So let's analyze this. So you told me that mace refers to a limb that comes from a dead body, and even if it doesn't have enough flesh to regenerate, it still conveys tumah. So asks the Gemara, tell me a little bit about this aver. Hey Chidami, what's the case? If it has a bone the size of a barley kernel, then Rabbi say that's no different than what? Touching an etzem kisaora, which conveys tumah. I don't need the case of the flesh then. Rather, it must be what? It must be a case of where the limb not only does not have enough flesh to regenerate, but also what? It has less than a barley kernel size of bone fragment in it as well. And yet what? And even so, the Torah says that what? That it's still matame. So we'll say this is a proof to Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish wanted to suggest that what? That even if you have a limb that comes either from a dead person or from a live person, and even if it doesn't have enough flesh to regenerate, and even if it doesn't have etzem kisa, or it still conveys tumah, and Reish Lakish suggested that it's the pasuk itself that's marba this. Here Reish Lakish has proved it. So the Gemara says, Amar l'cha Rabbi Yochanan, no. Li'olam de isbei. Not true. We're dealing over here with the case of where the limb has an etzem kisa ora. But 1 second, if it has an etzem kisa ora, then Abba say, why does it have to tell me that a limb that doesn't have enough flesh to regenerate but has etzem kisa ora is what? It was yesterday, okay. That a bone that doesn't have an etzem kisaora ultimately is metame. I'm sorry. If it has etzem, according to Rabbi Yochanan says the case of the limb that the Torah is talking about is a case of where it has etzem kisaora. If it has etzem kisaora, then obviously it's metame. Because you're supposed to remember again, the etzem kisaora even without the limb is metame. All the more so if the etzem kisaora is part of a limb, so of course it's metame. So if that's the case, why does the Torah have to say it? And Rabbi Yochanan makes an interesting argument. He says that what? That Lamaisa, the Torah is teaching me that not only is a limb with the etzem kisa or a metame b'maga, but it's also metame b'masa. It's also metame even if what Rabbi say, even if you hold it or you carry it without what? Without directly touching it. Take a quick look at Rashi. Rabbi Yochanan Amar l'chal li'olam de'isba etzem kisa ora. V'em eno inyan l'magao denafkale mehanogeh be'etzem Tinei inyan lemaso. Aval ein ha'etzem kisor v'labasa kroi li'olam ein tumaso klum ve'ein hanozir megaleach halav. So both say the Gemara still ends off with the fundamental machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Yochanan saying that if you don't have a bone fragment the size of, if you don't have etzem kisaora in the limb is not metame. And when we say not metame, remember, for our purposes, that means two things. Number one, it doesn't convey tumah, but for our Maseches Nazir purposes, it means that if a Nazir comes in contact with a limb that doesn't have etzem kisaora, assuming also that it doesn't have enough flesh to regenerate, that the Nazir would not have to stop his Nazir, shave his head, and start again. Reish Lakish says no, that even if the limb has less than an etzem kisaora, and even if it doesn't have enough flesh to regenerate, haloch l'maisa, again, you will still have to go ahead and stop the Nazir to start all over again. Suppose say the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yochanan, namely that if the limb has to have one of two things. Either the limb has to have enough flesh to regenerate, the kizayis basar, that has either that. If it doesn't have that, it has to have etzem kisaora. If it has neither of those things, then the Rambam paskins that it will not convey tumah, and therefore, again, if a nazir comes in contact with it, the nazir will not have to restart his nazirus again. Says the Gemara Baiter. So remember again, the Mishnah said that if the Nazir comes in contact with any of these forms of Tumah, so remember again, he'll go ahead and the assumption is he's Tamei Tumas Meis. So how do you become tar from Tumas Meis? You take the ashes of Paraduma, mixed with waters, and it's sprinkled on the mace on days 3 and on days 7. So says the Gemara Bailahu, Hadik Tani Achiyeta B'Shvi'i, Kai ad Avid Herev Shemesh. I'm sorry. Hadik Tani ad Shitar Bishvi Kai or ad Avid Herev Shemesh. So we'll say here's the interesting shaila. So the Omani Rabbi Elazar he O Dilma Bishmini Kai Umay ad Shitar ad Shiavi Karbanos Omani Rabbanon. So we'll say when the Mishnah says that Lamaisa he sprinkles on day 3 and on day 7, and then again he's able to restart his Nazirus. When exactly is he able to start his Nazirus? Does it mean on day 7? Remember what's happening on day number 7. On day number 7 is the sprinkling. On day number 7 is the immersion in the mikvah, and on day number 7 is the hair cutting, right, from his previous Nazirus. All that's happening on day number 7. So do we say that he could restart his now second round of Nazirus after all those things are done, and therefore day number 7 could effectively begin the first day of his new Nazirite vow, and therefore it would reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer, who we saw earlier, or, and I will say that's Rashi points out over here, he says, the Amar Rabbi Eliezer, the Amar Beparak Misha Amar Harini Nazir Megaleach, Maschilumona Miyad Mishum Vikidesh Etzroshos. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that he could begin to count already on day number 7, or Odilma Bishmini Kai. Maybe it means that when does he begin his second Nazir? Suppose I went on day number 8. Umay Achi Yitar. What does it mean until he becomes pure? Achi Yavi Karbanos. So it means until he brings his Karbanos. Umani, and because also remember we spoke about this extensively, he brings Karbanos on day number 8. Umani, and whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbanon, it reflects the view ultimately again of the Rabbanon. So which one is it? Does he begin on day number 7 in according to Rabbi Eliezer, or day number 8 according to the Rabbanon? So the Gemara says Tashma. The Gemara says, well, let's try to learn this out. Mediktani Seifa, since the end of the Mishnah says Maschil Umona Miyad. The end of the Mishnah says he restarts his second Nazir, and he begins to count immediately. So Ha Reisha My Ad Sheyitar. I will say, so what can we infer when the Reisha says that he can't go ahead and begin his new Nazirus until he becomes pure? Ad Sheyavi Karbanosov. It means ultimately until he brings his karbanos. Umani Rabbanan he da'amri Nazirus the Tara ad Shmini lo chayla. So we'll say, so the Gemara says from the fact that the Reisha ultimately says, from the fact that the Seifa says Maschil Umona Miyad, that he begins to count immediately. Therefore, when the Reisha uses lashon of Sheyitar, at Sheyitar must mean what? Karbanos. And therefore, Allah Lamaisa, what the Gemara says is in this particular case, where the Nazir becomes Tamei Alt Tumas Meis, and he goes ahead and therefore has to end his first Nazirus, has to then restart a second Nazirus. When does the second Nazirus begin? Day number 8, only after the Karbanos have been offered. Fine. We'll say Mishnah. Aval. Hasichachos v'hapiraos ubeis hapratz. Let's analyze each of these one by one. Aval hasichachos. So we'll say, remember we spoke about sichachos yesterday. Rashi points out over here. Aval hasichachos. Dahainu ilon hamesach ala aretz v'yesh tuma tachas nof be'echad mehem ve'eno yadua kineged mis. So we'll say the case over there, and the Gemara is going to expound on this more. We're talking about sichachos. Is a tree. So you have a tree with branches. The assumption is, by the way, that the branches are at least a tefach wide, because remember, in order for something to be an ohel, a roof, there has to be at least a tefach. So if the branches are a tefach wide, and there's a mace, bless you, but the branches themselves are not contiguous, meaning there are spaces in between the branches. There's a mace, so there's tumah underneath one of the branches. I walked under the tree, I don't know exactly where I went. So I'll say that would be a case of tumah, or a case of potential tumah, or peros. What's peros? So again, we'll define exactly what this is in the Gemara in just a little bit. Savas chachos vaperos ubeis hapras. So actually, just take a look at Rashi. Rashi says v'chein tachas avanim haperuos hayotzos chutz min hageder v'tuma tachas achas mehem ve'in yadua la'adam alach tach nazir tachtein. So we actually had peros yesterday. So peros was, there's a wall, one of the stones of the wall extends, and essentially forms a roof, an ohel, over tuma that's on the ground. So you have the schachos, the peros, beis hapras. We'll say beis hapras is a field in which, again, I know there was a grave at some point in time, but subsequently the field has been plowed over, and the location of the grave is no longer known. Okay, the Eretz Ha'amim. Well, the Eretz Ha'amim means general, again, lands outside of Eretz Yisrael. V'hagolel v'hadofek. I will say this is interesting as well. Golel and dofek. Golel is, for now, we'll translate it just simply as the cover of the coffin, and dofek will translate for now as the walls of the coffin. Again, we will redefine those in just a little bit. If you take a look, by the way, at Rashi for just one moment, he says, Eretz Ha'amim, Shenazar ba'aretz, talking about a person who became a Nazir in Eretz Yisrael, Ubesoch yimei Nazirusa yatsa v'nichnas le'Eretz Ha'amim. And he went ahead, and during his Nazirite vow, he went out to go ahead, and he went chutz la'aretz. Okay. Or, next case, Revi'as dam, or Revi'as of blood, or v'ohel v'rova atzamos, or you have, let's say, you have a quarter of a kav of bones underneath the roof within an ohel, or v'kelim hanogim v'meis, or I will say you have utensils that ultimately came in contact with the mace, and now the Nazir's now the Nazir is touching them. Ubiyimei sifro, ubiyimei gemaro. So we'll say this is talking about over here the case of where the Nazir becomes a metzora. So ubiyimei sifro refers to the 7 days that he has to observe if he's what's called a metzora muchlat, a definitive Nazir, and bimei gemaro refers to the days ultimately when he's a Metzora himself until he starts the 7 clean days. So again, we'll define all of these terms in the Gemara, but what's the common denominator among all of these cases? Al elu ein hanazir megalech. Rabbi is saying all of these cases, if a Nazir comes in contact with these forms of Tumah, these do not require the Nazir to end his current Nazirus and have to start again. However, Umazeh b'shlishi ub'shvi, but he has to go ahead and get sprinkled with the ashes of the para aduma on days 3 and 7 of his purification process. Ve'ino soser es hakodmin, but again, he does not lose the days of Nazirus that he has already observed. Umaschil umona miyad, and he can continue to count his Nazirus immediately. The carbon ein lo, and Rabbi say he doesn't have a carbon. What does it mean he doesn't have a carbon? Now remember, it's another way of saying he's not a Nazir Tameh. So remember, part of being a Nazir Tameh is you have to stop your Nazirus, you have to cut your, and you have to bring a carbon. He doesn't have to bring the carbon for Nazirus Tameh, and therefore be'emes amru. Therefore, the rabbi said, Yemei hazav v'hazava v'yemei hazgero shel metzora hare elu olun lo. The rabbi said that in reality, the days in which he is a zav, or a zava, v'imei has gero. So we'll say his gero. These are the days. Those are the first days. Sometimes a person could have a certain type of blemish on their skin where there's a chashash that it's saras, but it's not definitive that it's saras. So what do we do with such a person like that? We put him essentially in isolation for 7 days. So the rabbi said that the days of zivus, the days that he's locked away because we want to see if he's a mitzora or not, all of these days, hare elu olin lo. All of these days count as what? Count as towards his nazirus. Fine. So we'll say how we're going to analyze this. The elu hina sechachos. So we'll say what's the case of sechachos? Remember, so this is tree overhang. Says the Gemara. Ilan hamesach al haaretz. This is talking about a tree that extends over the ground. Uperaos hayotzos min hageder, and it refers to stone protrusions from the wall. So let's analyze this a little bit. Take a look at the Rosh Hashanah. Ilon hamesach al haaretz va'anafav muvdalin. Its leaves, its branches are separated. V'yesh kizayis meis tachas echad min ha'anafim ve'ein yadua tachas eza. So we'll say this is a case essentially over here of Safek Tumah. This is a case of Safek Tumah, right? Remember again, I know that the branches are wide enough to form an ohel because they're at least a tefach wide. I also know that's what? That there's a maze somewhere here. What's the only issue? I don't know where. I know I walked around the tree. The shaila is, did I come in contact with the mace? Did I contract tumas ohel or not? Look at the next rush. V'chein paros. Avanim haboltos min hageder. This refers to stones that extend out of the wall. V'yish kizayis min ameis tachas achas mehen, and there is a kizayis from a corpse underneath one of the protrusions. Ve'ein yadua tachas eza, but I don't know under which protrusion. Umayri shein rechavos tefach, and remember in both of these cases the stone protrusion and the branches are at least a tefach wide. Dahachin masha parak damanido b'sofo shemahale tachas kulo tame vada elisha avir mafsik beinehem v'halech hanazir tachas achas mehem. So we'll say in these cases I'm walking under some of the branches, I'm walking under some of the stone protrusions. I don't know exactly which ones I walked under, so I don't know if I'm tame tumas mace or not. Watch this. V'yirli demari sha'ilan, skip down a little bit. I'm sorry, v'yirli, don't skip. V'yirli demari sha'ilan omid b'rishus harabim, b'china avon, and both b'rishus harabim. The suffix tuma b'rishus harabim tar, the chachamim gazra love tuma. Allah b'rishus hayachid have a tuma darai. So supposed to listen to this. Says Rash, what's happening over here? Why is it that when I walk under the tree, and I'm not sure if I was tummy tumas ohel, or I walk under the stone protrusions, and I'm not sure if I contracted tumas ohel, how does the Mishnah paskin? The Mishnah paskins ultimately, again, that's what? That I'm tahar. Why? Why don't we say safek daraisa l'chumra? Because what says Rash, there's another principle at play over here, which is safek tuma b'shus harabim. And we're going to see, actually, this is a principle that's espoused in Sota that we're going to learn, which is supposed to say safek tuma b'shus harabim. Whenever you have doubtful tuma in a public domain, that is always resolved l'kula, always resolved leniently, as opposed to safek tuma b'shus hayochid. If you have a doubt regarding tuma in private domain, that is resolved l'chumra. We actually learned that out from Sota. We'll discuss that at a later date. Therefore, the Rosh is suggesting over here that the reason why, if the Nazir walks under the tree cover, or the Nazir walks under the stone protrusions, it does not end his Nazirus, because it's a case of safek tuma b'rishus harabim, and therefore again will be resolved leniently, will not cause a stoppage of the Nazirus and require him to start again. Next, the Eretz Ha'amim. So let's remember, what was the next case? The next case was that the guy became a Nazir in Eretz Yisrael, and now he goes out of Eretz Yisrael. So we've learned already before that there is a rabbinic tumah on Tumas Ha'amim. There's a rabbinic tumah on Chutz La'aretz. Why is there a rabbinic tumah on Chutz La'aretz? So here's what's interesting. Actually, this is going to be the machlokes. Look at this. This is really fascinating. Eretz Ha'amim mishum avira gazra o dilma mishum gusha gazra. We'll say, what is the gezerah of Eretz Ha'amim? Is the gzeira on the earth? Is the gzeira on the land? That if I step foot outside of Eretz Yisrael, that there's rabbinic tumah, or is it in the air? So what does that mean? Obviously, by the way, there's a nafkamina in that. What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina, let's say I'm transported out of Eretz Yisrael into Chutz La'aretz in a way that I don't trod upon the soil, but I'm in the airspace of Chutz La'aretz. So does the air convey tumah, or ultimately again is it the ground? Now take a look at the Rosh for just a moment. So the Rosh says over here, actually, yes, take a look. Mishum avira gazru sha'avir yitama afilu eno mahil ala nosei kigon hanichnas la bekaron ubesvina or b'shida tevas migdal shemachzikim emsa she'inu makam tuma v'chotzim ifnei atuma. So let me just tell you this outside. So we'll see in just a moment. What does this mean? See, there are two ways of looking as to why Chazal went ahead and made tuman chutz la'aretz. So the classic understanding is that in Chutz La'aretz, the rabbis were concerned that people are not as makbid, people are not as careful about demarcating graves. Right? In Eretz Yisrael, they're much more careful because of Kohanim, because of Tumah, but Chutz La'aretz, anything goes. So we're afraid that wherever you go, there's a possibility there's a grave. And therefore, again, it's just rabbinic Tumah. That's one possibility. Second possibility I will say is that Chazal went ahead and decreed a rabbinic Tumah in Chutz La'aretz. Why? To discourage people from leaving Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, again, I will say, if that's the case, it's not just the soil that conveys Tumah, but it's the air that conveys Tumah as well. Just simply stepping out into Chutz La'aretz goes ahead and endows you with a level of rabbinic Tumah. So that's the Shaila. Eretz Ha'amim mishum avira gazra o dilma mishum gusha gazra are the lands outside Eretz Yisrael, are they tummy because of the airspace, or is the gzeira on the air, or is the gzeira mishum gusha? Gusha means the earth. So the Gemara says tashmas. Let's analyze this. So what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said that as much as when the Nazir goes out to Chutz La'aretz, it does not cause a stoppage of his Nazirus. But what did the Mishnah say he has to do? He has to be sprinkled with the ashes of the Para Aduma, on days 3 and 7. So what does that show you? Vi'i amrit mishum avira hazo'alamali. If the rabbinic gezerah on Chutz La'aretz is on the air, then what is he being sprinkled on with ashes of paraduma? But remember, ashes of paraduma is for what type of tumah? Tumas meis. The only time he's going to contract tumas meis is how? Is the saying if he's trotting upon the soil. So the fact that he has to go ahead and become tar through the paraduma indicates to us that what? That the gzir on Chutz La'aretz is mishum gusha, is on the soil. To which the Gemara says, lo, not necessarily. The olam emulacha mishum avira. It's not true. I could say that the gzera ultimately on Chutz La'aretz is because of the airspace. Rabbi say, by the way, if you take a look at the Rush, so the Rush says over here, he says, Vi'i amrit avira gazra lamali, Dechevan damir nechnas bedara chotes tame imkin lo gazra la mishum tuma, elo chumra ba'amech miro, kidesh lo yetze adam me eretz l'Yisrael lo Chutz La'aretz. So it's amazing. So the Gemara is saying, but by the fact that the Mishnah requires sprinkling on days 3 and 7, that indicates that no, this is not a trying to dissuade people from Yerida, from ultimately going from Eretz to Chutz La'aretz. This is a din in Tumah. So therefore, again, it must only apply to the actual earth and not to the airspace. To which the Gemara says, well, not necessarily. The olam em l'cha mishum avira. Not necessarily. Maybe the gzera on Chutz La'aretz is really about the airspace. V'chi katani asha'ara. And when the Mishnah says that the Nazir has to get sprinkled with ashes of para aduma on days 3 and day 7, that was not referring to this case. It wasn't referring to Chutz La'aretz. What was it referring to? It was referring to the other cases. Like if he comes in contact with the revius of blood, or he's under the same roof with a quarter kav of bones. Those cases have rabbinic tumas meis. But if you go out to Chutz La'aretz, where again the gzera is on the avir, so therefore the fact that the gzera is on the airspace, we'll say, now again, it doesn't mean it's not on the soil, but it means that the primary gzera is not a din of tumah, of tumas meis. The issue of Chutz La'aretz is that Chazal are trying to dissuade people from going to Chutz La'aretz. Therefore they say, if you go to Chutz La'aretz, you become rabbinically tameh. How do you rectify the rabbinic tameh? Go to the mikvah. But you don't require sprinkling on days 3 and 7. And therefore the Mishnah says you get sprinkled on days 3 and 7. That's referring to the other cases in the Mishnah. This approach seems to be clear. Midiktani, the kelim hanogim b'meis. Because also remember, one of the cases the Mishnah said was what? That if let's say you have a utensil that touches a mace, right? Let's say I have a utensil, I have a fork that touches the mace, and then what happens? And then again, I touch the fork. The Nazir touches the fork. So what did the Mishnah say? So Rabbi say, so remember, so you're telling me now that the Mishnah says that I have to get sprinkled on, right? I need the ash, the paradum on days 3 and 7. It doesn't make sense. Hani kelim b'nei haza'in. Rabbi say, it's not the way the laws of Tumah work. Meaning, again, remember, if something that touches a mace touches me, I become a Rishon. But ultimately, again, that Rishon does not require me to be sprinkled on to have the ash of the paraduma. Therefore, what do you see? Elashmamina ashara. Therefore, Rabbi say, you see that as much as that statement in the Mishnah that you have to get sprinkled on days 3 and day 7, we thought applied to all the cases of the Mishnah, in fact does not really apply to all the cases of the Mishnah, but rather only applies to certain ones. Therefore, again, the Gemara wants to suggest over here that Lamaisa, again, that when you go to Chutz La'aretz, it could very well be that the nature of the Tumah ultimately is on the Avir and not on the soil. I will say, I just want to take a few minutes. We'll stop over here in the Gemara, but I have to share with you something amazing. So we're not finished with this sugya, because the Gemara is going to say it's Machlokes, but I found something that's amazing. So listen to this. So just so you should know, the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, again, we'll get into whether or not it's Avira or Gusha tomorrow, but the Shulchan Aruch Paskins is in Yardea. Dechol Eretz Ha'amim, Aser lekoin letame bahem. It's amazing. Psak halacha in the Shulchan Aruch that a kohen is not permitted to go to Chutz La'aretz. Ultimately, again, because all the lands are tamei. So listen to this. So he quotes over here the Bach and the Prisha. Bach and the Prisha, right? V'chinok tushamataz ashach. Dezeu dafka. No. Bizman shehaya Eretz Yisrael b'tara. That when does this concept apply? This concept that a Kohen is not really permitted to go to Chutz La'aretz only applies in a situation where what? Where Eretz Yisrael was Betara. So when the laws of ritual purity are in effect and Eretz Yisrael is tar, a Kohen really should not venture out of Eretz Yisrael to go to Chutz La'aretz. V'yisrael yoshem ba'alad masan, aval bizmanenu ein chilik ben Eretz Yisrael la'Eretz Amim. But today, halach l'maisa, there's no real distinction between Eretz Yisrael and the other lands. Alts tumantara. So therefore, again, a Kohen, really, a Kohen who's in Eretz Yisrael is no more tummy or tar than a Kohen that's in Chutz La'aretz. Fine. Listen to this. Annam b'shalas etshuvah shvus Yaakov. So we'll say, Shvus Yaakov was Rav Yaakov Reischer, who lived from 1670 to 1733 in Prague. So the Shvus Yaakov says the following. He says, Chalik Aleim. He says something about this halakha doesn't make sense. This is amazing. Because of the Medehetiku HaTorah VaShulchan Aruch V'chein Ramadin Zeh, Amaduhu Nohoi Gam Bizmaninu. Di'im Kein Havili LaHashmitam Kedarkam She'inam Maviyin Davar Shulchas Al Mashiach. So the Shvus Yaakov asks Bam Kasha, he says, what are you talking about? He says, that's not how the Shulchan Aruch operates. The Shulchan Aruch only includes halachos that what? That apply to Apostle. You have to understand, that's the fundamental distinction between the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. See, the Rambam will include halachos that are even not in effect now, that were in effect and will be in effect. The Shulchan Aruch does not include any halachos that are temple or messianically related. Shulchan Aruch only talks about halacha l'maisa. Says Shvus Yaakov, the Shulchan Aruch says that a Kohen can't go to Chutz La'aretz because ultimately, again, it's tamei. So the Bach and everyone else wants to say, that's mishchistic, right? That's future in Eretz Yisrael's B'tara. She's like, what are you talking about? That's how the Shulchan Aruch operates. So we'll say now we've got a very big problem because what is the Shulchan Aruch talking about? Listen to this. So he says, "Ve'in lomar shehochrach lefarish kemi mashra bizmanenu ay elu harbe kohanim mefuzar mufradim be'eretz ha'amim upok chazi my amadavar ach imishum ha lo kashamidi." So listen to this. So maybe you'll say, "Well, look, the truth is, this is one of those things where you have to say this because how can you possibly reconcile the din of the Shulchan Aruch with what?" With what happens today. Meaning, how can we have a psak halacha on the books that says that Kohanim shouldn't be in Chutz La'aretz? When what? When you have a lot of Kohanim in Chutz La'aretz, meaning something doesn't shtim, as they say. Right? I'm sorry? So it could be a sign, but you do have, fine. Let's say, but what about Kohanim Miyuchas? I mean, you do have Miyuchas, so you do have Kohanim like that still. So look what he says. He says that Chevan da anachnu mishubadim tachas hagoyim umehem parnasas. And listen to this. Uparnasas anshe beso v'lav kol adam zochel knisas eretz bizmanim elu mipnei all hashibud v'sakanas hadrachim al kin nispashet heter zeh. So the simple answer could be that what says the Shvus Yaakov. The truth is, both sides. There are reasons that you're permitted to leave Eretz Yisrael, which is for parnasa. Right, for marriage purposes. So maybe that's the heter. Maybe today, since it's easier, I guess it's easier to make a parnasa in Chutz La'aretz than it is to make an Eretz Yisrael. He actually also brings down sakanas hadrachim. This idea that it's not simple, it's not, it's not easy, it's not always safe. Again, I those are not my words. I would never. I'm using his words. That again, he's reflecting a time where it was not safe to be in Eretz Yisrael. I think I'm just saying it because you have to be so careful. To never ever say anything that could be construed in any negative way about Eretz Yisrael. It's the most magnificent. I'm sorry. Travel to it. Correct. It's passage to it, but he's also referring to sakana in it, which again is reflecting of his times where there wasn't Jewish autonomy in Eretz Yisrael. So the idea ultimately is, he's saying that maybe because of all of these things, remember again, Chazal already said, the same Chazal that said that there's rabbinic tumah in Eretz Yisrael are the same ones who said that what? That you can leave Eretz Yisrael for certain reasons. Let's say I find the Rebbe or I find the yeshiva, that's the place for me. I can go to Chutz La'aretz for that, I can go to Chutz La'aretz to get married, and I can go to Chutz La'aretz to make a parnasa. So you see that even Chazal, even though Chazal said we don't want you leaving Eretz Yisrael, there's tumah in Chutz La'aretz, Chazal also gave you certain dispensations. So it says Shvus Yaakov, it's possible that Lamaisa, again, it's possible that Halacha Lamaisa, that's why we're makel on it. Because again, maybe people have these reasons, therefore they can be in Chutz La'aretz. Listen to what he writes. So therefore, again, that's what the Shvus Yaakov explains. That it must be that Halacha Lamaisa, because in his time he's writing, it's dangerous to travel to Eretz Yisrael, it's dangerous to live in Eretz Yisrael, plus we have all of these licenses to leave Eretz Yisrael, bless you, that must be why even Kohanim are permitted to go ahead and be in Chutz La'aretz today, even though there's Tumah. But look what he writes, and this is wild. He says, Al pizeh kasav shiyotze mizeh kula. Says the Shvus Yaakov, it turns out that now that we say that Kohanim have a license to be in Chutz La'aretz today because of either marriage, Torah, Parnasa, Sakana. Listen to this, it's amazing kula. Shekevan shakohanim shem b'chutz la'aretz heim temeim kol hazman b'tumah d'Rabbanan su leka aleihem isura lihitamos b'tumah d'Rabbanan. Says the Shvus Yaakov, therefore the halacha is that since Kohanim today, and at least in Chutz La'aretz, it's really true of Kohanim in general, but Chutz La'aretz specifically, are constantly in a state of Tumah D'Rabbanan, there is no problem with further exposure to Tumah D'Rabbanan. Dahari zet Tumah B'chiburin, Chayvan Dehim Tmeim B'Tumah D'Rabbanan Va'omdim. So amazing enough, so he says that halacha l'maisa again, that you could have a situation where a kohen could go ahead and become tamei tumah d'Rabbanan. Now, by the way, just you should understand, a lot of the cases we deal with tumah, ultimately again are tumah d'Rabbanan, right? So, for example, technically speaking, a kohen entering into a cemetery, you could find many different ways in which that could happen, where you're only in violation of rabbinic issues. So the Shvus Yaakov actually wants to suggest that because again, Kohanim who live in Chutz La'aretz, by definition, are steeped every single moment in Tumah D'Rabbanan. When it comes to Tumah D'Rabbanan, there's no issue of heaping Tumah Abanan. See, that's one of the interesting biblical Tumah and rabbinic Tumah. Biblical Tumah, each act of exposing yourself to Tumah is an independent liability. Tumah D'Rabbanan, it's all one state. Once you're Tamei Tumah D'Rabbanan, says Shvus Yaakov, there's no problem adding on to it. Therefore, he posits that a kohen in Chutz La'aretz can actually become Tamei Tumah D'Rabbanan, no problem. But look how he ends. It's amazing. Elashem Dilo Miloo Libo Lahakil Bedavar Shes Pashet Isura. Says the Shvus Yaakov, but you know what? I can't bring myself to be Mekil when Kohanim are machmir on themselves. Isn't this amazing? Yeah, I can't bring myself to be Mekil. He says, but however, he says, I'll tell you where this does come up. Ulam, but he wants to suggest is that if there's an issue of kavod abrios, which again the Chassam services, we're not going to get into it today, that it could be that there's a kula for this. So I'm just pointing out that it's just interesting to see. So again, halacha l'maisa, there is this position of the Shvus Yaakov, who holds that based on the Psach of the Shulchan Aruch, which we'll discuss this Psach, because this is a very problematic psak as to what exactly you do with this. So remember, we have two interpretations of the psak, according to the Bach, the Prisha, the Taz, and the Shach. So the psak of the Shulchan Aruch that a kohen can't be in Eretz Ha'amim, that's only when Eretz Yisrael is betara. If Eretz Yisrael is not betara, like it is, it's not betara today. Therefore, there's no real prohibition on kohen being in Chutz La'aretz. The Shvus Yaakov says that's not true. Even if that's not how the Shulchan Aruch paskins, even if it's still usher, there are licenses for kohanim to go ahead and be in Chutz La'aretz, namely parnasa, marriage, Torah, sakana. That gives the license. But the kula is, now that we know that a kohanim are already Tamein Midrabanan, said the Shvus Yaakov, there's no problem with adding on to that Tumah D'Rabbanan. However, again, as psak halacha, the Shvus Yaakov says, I'm hesitant to come out with a resounding psak and to be makel on something that kohanim are machmir on. All right, we'll stop over here. That kula is an extension of the